on this Tuesday edition of Newsline at noon, Japan's ruling parties have agreed to a reinterpretation of the country's pacifist constitution to lift a decades-old ban on helping an ally under attack. A government announcement is due later today. Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Seoul this week breaks the tradition of a Chinese head of state going to Pyongyang before the South and underscores the changing power dynamics in Northeast Asia. Plus, the Korean stock market has lost its vitality, with the benchmark index moving in the narrowest band in more than 2 decades this year. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's noon Tuesday, July 1st here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Ju.
Very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this lunchtime: a historic shift is taking place in Japan today. The Abe administration there is about to reinterpret Japan's more than 6-decade-long pacifist policy in a way that will allow Tokyo to play a much greater military role here in Asia.
Japan's ruling parties reportedly agreed on this Tuesday to lift a ban on the country's right to exercise collective self-defense. The change is expected to be adopted in a cabinet resolution later today. Hwang Sung-hee starts us off.
Japan's ruling parties have given the green light to a government proposal to end a ban that has kept the Japanese military from fighting overseas since World War II. This is according to a ruling party lawmaker who said the change will be adopted in a cabinet resolution later in the day. A draft of the cabinet resolution shows the change, which will significantly expand Japan's military options by lifting the ban on exercising collective self-defense, thereby allowing the country to aid its allies under an attack beyond its borders. Limits on activities in UN-led peacekeeping operations will also be eased. The move is being seen by some as the biggest shift in Japan's defense policy since the end of World War II. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has aggressively pursued the change since taking office 18 months ago, despite some public opposition stemming from concerns about entanglement in foreign wars. A poll conducted by Japan's Mainichi Shimbun over the weekend showed nearly 60% of the Japanese public is against the revision. Tokyo's latest move is sure to set off alarm bells in Seoul and Beijing, the victims of Japan's wartime aggression. The South Korean government has said that Japanese forces will not be allowed on the Korean peninsula without its consent. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
North Korea and Japan have resumed high-level talks in Beijing to discuss follow-up measures to agreements made on the issue of Japanese nationals abducted by North Korea decades ago. The meeting comes about a month after the two countries made a deal in Stockholm on reinvestigating the abduction issue. In return, Japan has promised to lift sanctions and resume humanitarian aid to North Korea, marking a diplomatic breakthrough between the two nations. Today's meeting comes just 48 hours after Pyongyang fired 2 short-range missiles into the East Sea between Korea and Japan. Japanese officials lodged a strong protest against the launch during the opening part of the meeting. And over in Hawaii, the top military officials of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will hold talks Tuesday local time on North Korea and other key security-related issues on the sidelines of the ongoing RIMPAC exercises. Seoul's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Choi Yoon-hee, will sit down with his U.S. counterpart Martin Dempsey and Shigeru Iwasaki from Japan to discuss ways to deal with the nuclear threat posed by Pyongyang. The U.S.-led trilateral meeting will end with a joint statement by the 3 commanders. The RIMPAC exercise, which kicked off at the end of June, is the world's largest international naval drill, with 23 countries taking part. This year's exercise is especially significant as China is participating in the U.S.-led drill for the first time.
South Korea will welcome Chinese President Xi Jinping to Seoul this week in a visit that could signal a significant shift in the region's really rather complicated power dynamics. The Chinese leader breaking with tradition in visiting the South before his country's traditional ally in Pyongyang will discuss ways to help denuclearize the Korean peninsula during his talks with South Korean President Park Geun-hye. Park Ji-won reports.
This week's trip will mark the first time ever for a Chinese leader to visit South Korea before North Korea. Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit Seoul for 2 days starting this Thursday in a visit that is expected to send a strong message to Beijing's traditional ally. Relations between China and North Korea have soured recently. Beijing was not happy when Pyongyang went ahead with a third nuclear test in February of last year, despite China's warnings. China's leadership was also deeply disappointed by the purge and subsequent execution of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's uncle Chang Song-taek late last year. Chang, who enjoyed a good relationship with Beijing, have made major contributions to an expansion of commercial ties with China, while measures to end Pyongyang's nuclear program are expected to top the agenda during their bilateral summit talks. President Xi and South Korean President Park Geun-hye will also discuss other issues, including ways to deepen their economic cooperation. Watchers say that as China is South Korea's top trade partner and South Korea has the highest number of Chinese language proficiency test takers, it's only natural the two countries' ties have strengthened. The summit meeting also signifies a shift in multilateral relations in Northeast Asia, where the traditional Cold War front of South Korea, the US and Japan versus North Korea, China and Russia is looking increasingly more complex. While South Korea and China continue to butt heads with Japan over various historical and territorial disputes, Japan and North Korea are taking strides to normalize their once frosty bilateral relations. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
The United States government is requesting to North Korea for it to free 2 recently detained American tourists as soon as possible.
Out of humanitarian concern for Mr. Fowle and Mr. Miller and their families, we request North Korea release them so they may return home.
Now, Washington's call comes after North Korean state media said Monday that there was enough evidence to move forward with indictments against Matthew Miller and Jeffrey Fowle for carrying out what it called hostile acts against the nation. The 2 men entered North Korea separately back in April. The State Department also asked that North Korea grant Korean-American Kenneth Bae special amnesty and release him immediately. Mr. Bae is serving a 15-year sentence with hard labor on charges of trying to overthrow the government.
Just a little over 10 years ago, the 2 Koreas began operation of their jointly run Kaesong Industrial Complex in the North Korean border city. And our Sun Jung-in gives us a look at how far the inter-Korean cooperation project has come over the last decade and also what the future might hold.
On June 30th, 2004, 15 South Korean companies began running factories at the North Korean border city of Kaesong. 10 years later, the Kaesong Industrial Complex has seen significant growth. The number of South Korean businesses has jumped from 15 to 125, and the number of North Korean workers from 6,000 to 52,000. The production volume at the factory zone has increased over 30-fold from $50 million to nearly $470 million at present. But the complex has had its struggles. Last year, North Korea unilaterally suspended operations for 5 months amid escalating inter-Korean tensions. The 2 Koreas have held 5 rounds of talks to prevent a recurrence of similar incidents, but have failed to make much progress.
The 2 Koreas do not have a framework for ministerial-level dialogue, and almost all inter-Korean cooperation is at a standstill.
But despite the risks, South Korean businesses find Kaesong Complex attractive. The Kaesong Complex offers cheap labor at a cost of around $150 a month per worker, and goods are transferred over land, which means they can be on the shelves the day they're manufactured.
Small and medium-sized firms in South Korea struggle after 5 years in business. but those in Kaesong are flourishing, even after 10 years. The two Koreas have formed an economic community, which we see as a small reunification.
The Kaesong complex is now taking baby steps toward globalization, with around 20 foreign companies showing interest in investing in the joint business park, but concerns about stability are holding the companies back. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on NEWSLINE at Noon with Mark Broom and Jin-ju.
I'm Jin-ju.
Market researcher, strategy analytics said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about...
Korea's stock market is losing its momentum, with the benchmark Kospi fluctuating in the smallest margin ever in the first 6 months of this year. And analysts say this is mainly due to slowing economic growth at home. Hwang Sung-hee tells us more.
It seems like a pause button has been pushed on the Korean stock market. The Korea Exchange says that the nation's benchmark Kospi is losing its dynamics, with the market volatility in the first half of the year hitting its lowest point since 1990, when the market first opened. The index measuring the volatility of the market stood at a mere 0.6. The market is less volatile as it approaches zero. The figure was at over 2 in the second half of 2011, but has continued on a downward trajectory since then. The market volatility from 1990 until June this year stood at over 1.5, reflecting how stagnant the market was in the first 6 months of the year. And it's not just the dynamics, but also the number of transactions that remain subdued. The number of average daily transactions on the Kospi came in at around 23 million in the first half of the year, which marks the lowest level in 7.5 years. Analysts say the slow growth at home, coming from sluggish domestic demand and slowing exports due to the strong local currency, is keeping the stock market from perking up. They add that the outlook for the second half does not look that bright either, as they expect disappointing earnings from major listed companies like Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motor. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
And the Korean New Exchange, or as it's otherwise known, the KONEX, marks its first anniversary today. Korea's third stock market platform was designed specifically to help small companies raise capital, but it was born out of President Park Geun-hye's vision to promote an environment where startup businesses can flourish. So how well is the market doing so far? Kim Ji-yeon reports.
This Tuesday marks the one-year anniversary of the foundation of the Korea New Exchange, or KONEX, a stock market tailor-made for startups. KONEX was set up to make it easier for small companies to raise funds and reduce their reliance on bank loans to start and run businesses. More than 55 companies are listed in the KONEX, with a total market value of $1.2 billion. KONEX falls in line with President Park Geun-hye's initiative toward a creative economy, which envisions a convergence of creative ideas and entrepreneurship to create new jobs and markets. Kim Gun-ho, the president of the KONEX Association and FN Guide Incorporated, which is listed on the KONEX, says his company is building experience and taking an important step toward being listed on the tech-heavy Kosdaq.
Listed companies think it's a crucial step, a trial and error period to build a relationship with potential investors before listing on the Kosdaq. But most of them have not gained financially from listing on the KONEX, not yet at least.
The lack of participation in the KONEX has been pointed out as a deficiency. The amount of transactions in an average day is less than $198,000, with less than 48,000 shares traded daily. So to induce more investors, the government has lowered the standards of qualifications. The Financial Services Commission reduced the required deposit by 1/3 to 100 million Korean won, around $99,000. The commission also slashed the minimum number of trading units from 100 shares to 1 share, the same as the Kosdaq. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, staying on the trade front, but at the national level, Korea logged a trade surplus for the 29th straight month in June. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy said Tuesday that exports amounted to $47.8 billion last month. That's up 2.5% from a year earlier. Imports rose 4.5% from the previous year to stand at $42.6 billion. That translates to a trade surplus of $5.29 billion. And Korea's consumer price growth stayed in the 1% range for the 8th straight month in June. A report by Statistics Korea says the country's consumer price index rose 1.7% last month from the previous year, the same growth rate recorded in May. The report shows the core inflation rate, which excludes food and oil prices, rose 2.1% from the previous year. That's slightly lower than the 2.2% increase back in May. The report also shows prices for agriculture, livestock and fisheries products have declined by 1% from a year before, while electricity, tap water and gas prices kept overall prices up with a jump of 4.2% in June.
Time now for a look through the international headlines for following this hour. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the news center.
So, Eunice, in Ukraine, the president has refused to extend the truce with pro-Russian rebels there, vowing instead to go on the attack.
That's right, Mark. President Petro Poroshenko said military operations are back on to, quote, free our land from what he called gangs of marauders, effectively ending that 10-day-old truce. There had been hope earlier that the ceasefire would be extended once more to allow for more dialogue between Ukraine, Russia, and the separatists, but Poroshenko said given that rebels had violated the truce on numerous occasions, even as it was in place, and Russia showed no concrete steps to de-escalate the crisis and to strengthen control over borders, he decided to call it off. Late Monday, the French presidential office had said Ukraine and Russia agreed to work on a bilateral ceasefire following four-way talks amongst leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. Israelis are mourning the apparent murder of 3 teenagers, their presumed bodies found in an open field in the West Bank on Monday. 2 were 16 years old and 1 19, last seen hitchhiking home at a junction near Hebron nearly 20 days ago. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held Palestinian faction Hamas responsible, promising it will pay for the abduction and cold-blooded murder of the young men. Hamas, which had called for Israel's destruction, had dismissed the charge as stupid and baseless. And early Tuesday morning, Israeli troops raided the homes belonging to the family of the 2 suspects believed to be behind the crime, setting off explosions. Israel has also confirmed it conducted airstrikes against Hamas targets on the Gaza Strip. The battle for Tikrit continues one day after the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant declared an Islamic caliphate across Syria and Iraq. Helicopters hit ISIL posts overnight as residents spoke of clashes in the southern outskirts. Iraqi forces have been fighting to expel the Sunni insurgency, doggedly holding on to the northwestern city and Saddam Hussein's hometown since its fall last month. ISIL's naming its leader as the Imam and Caliph for Muslims everywhere received mixed reaction. While followers welcomed the news, others in Syria and Iraq condemned it. A spokesman for the rebel group Army of Islam called ISIL delusional, adding a state cannot be created through looting, sabotage, and bombing. And finally, French bank BNP Paribas has agreed to pay a record sum of nearly $9 billion, pleading guilty to 2 criminal charges related to U.S. money laundering laws. France's largest bank had faced allegations it helped countries like Iran, Sudan, and other blacklisted nations move billions of dollars to dodge U.S. sanctions against terrorists and human rights abusers. Also, in another first, U.S. regulators banned BNP from conducting certain greenback transactions for a year. blocking a critical part of the bank's international business. In explaining the severe penalties, authorities pointed to BNP's consistent violations over a period of at least 10 years, despite warnings issues.
Thanks, Eunice, for that. And to the latest from the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. France made it to the quarterfinals in Monday's action, beating Nigeria 2-0. It was a relatively close match right up until Paul Pogba scored France's first goal in the 79th minute. And despite Nigeria's tireless efforts, Joseph Yobo's own goal secured France's advance to the last 8. France will meet Germany in the next round after the Germans beat Algeria 2-1 after extra time in a thrilling end-to-end match. Germany's Andreas Schüller scored 2 minutes after the start of extra time, and Mesut Ozil netted Germany's second 1 minute before the end. Algeria managed to get a consolation goal in the last minute, but it was too late to make a dramatic comeback. Kickoff time for the France-Germany quarterfinals is Saturday, July 5th at 1 a.m. Korea time.
Scientists around the world have tried and failed to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease since its discovery back in 1906. But now, a Korean research team has identified the cause of memory loss from this most common form of dementia, which could potentially, let's hope so, open up gateways to the treatment of this fatal brain disease. Kwon Soo-ah reports.
In a scene from the Korean movie A Moment to Remember, a young woman suffering from Alzheimer's disease can't find her way home. Like her, the memory loss caused by the gradual damage of brain cells can often cause people to lose their way. In fact, in Korea, around 7,600 elderly people with Alzheimer's have been reported missing yearly. The disease is not only fatal, but incurable. But now, a Korean research team has discovered the source of what leads to the loss of memory in Alzheimer's, which is raising hopes of opening a new chapter in the development of treatments. The cause of the impairment, researchers say, lies in the so-called reactive astrocytes that develop once the brain is affected by the disease. Astrocytes are the most abundant cell type in the brain, and reactive astrocytes produce an acid called gamma-aminobutyric, or GABA. They found that these acids in affected mice began to produce abnormally large amounts of GABA, a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. An experiment showed that mice that were injected with an inhibitor called selegiline, which suppresses the generation of GABA, regained their memories. However, after more than 2 weeks during which the injections were administered, the effects disappeared, which calls for the next step in the research process.
We found that the effects of selegiline grow weaker when it is taken in for a long time. We are currently working on the development of 3 kinds of MAO-B inhibitors with long-lasting efficacy.
The research, supported by the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, has been published in the highly cited medical journal Nature Medicine. Kwon Soo-ah, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Today is going to be hotter than yesterday. The high in Seoul will rise to 31 degrees Celsius, and most regions will see top temperatures rising up into the low 30s. But there is a chance of passing showers in some areas in the east, but we'll have plenty of sun shining down on us for most of the day. And that means high UV levels are expected, so be extra careful outside between the hours of 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. as this is when the sun is at its strongest. And as you may know, hot and humid weather condition creates favorable conditions for bacteria, so be careful to avoid food poisoning. With that in mind, here are the readings for today. The afternoon high here in the capital will rise to 31, while Daegu will soar to 33, and Busan should make it up to 28. Now for other regions, down on Jeju and Daejeon should see a high of 28 and 31. Dokdo will reach 25, and Mount Kumgang should get up to 20. Well, that's all for me today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
And those are the stories we're following at this hour.
Jinju and I will be back at the same time tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.